Today we have the famous story of Abraham going to sacrifice his son Isaac. All sacrifices, all religious rites and rituals from any religion is meant to try to put us on the right side of God or the goddesses or gods. And suddenly Abraham has this most horrific command from God. Now, human sacrifice in the ancient Middle East was rather common, unfortunately. And this brings us to a key question. There's been a statement repeated so many times that even believers believe it. The statement that there's been more human suffering in the world because of religion than for any other cause. It's been hammered into us over and over. And yet, not only is it false, it's easily repudiated. Now, you take all the human sacrifices that were done in ancient Middle East, and the human sacrifices done by the Mayans and Aztecs, who were the greatest human sacrificers in history. You take all of the religious wars, the jihads, the crusades. You take all of the inquisitions. You take all of the forced conversions due to military action. And you add them all up in reasonable figures. And then you look at the wars of the 20th century, and the wars of the 20th century far eclipsed all of that. And actually, we haven't had a good religious war since the wars of the Reformation. By far, the casualties are much higher. The chief cause for suffering in the world and murder and death is the struggle for the control of natural resources. Water, fertile land, other mineral rights, etc. And if we look to Asia, you'll hardly find any religious wars in the whole history of the rise and fall of China in the various dynasties. No one was trying to get people to worship the emperor. They were trying to increase the emperor's control of natural resources. And on it goes through history. Very few religious wars in Africa, but the tribal nations, some of them rose to great power. Always the conflicts are over the control of natural resources, and the same is true today. So that's easily refuted, but no one takes the time to refute it. Now, Abraham goes to offer his son, because to have a child was a great blessing. To be fertile was a great source of strength and joy in the ancient world. And Abraham had an unusual spiritual journey in his life. He moved from Ur of the Chaldeans up to Haran, like moving through Iraq up to central Turkey. And at every town he stopped at, there was a shrine, a pagan shrine, and he prayed at all of them, hoping mainly that he and his wife might have a child. Nothing worked. Finally, when he settled in Haran and thought that that would be the end of his life, God called him to move down to what we now call the Holy Land, and promised him that he would be blessed with a child. And in their old age, that blessing came true. But now, suddenly, God wants that child back. Now, we tend to think of his son Isaac as like a 12 or 13-year-old, thanks to Renaissance paintings. We always see this depicted. Here's a young teenager or a child even younger going off to be sacrificed. But it was first pointed out to me by a rabbi that if you do the biblical calculations, no, the son was an adult son in his early 30s. And this is an important part of the story. Here's an adult son who could have overpowered his father, but didn't. He trusted in his father, was totally dedicated to his father. And he's questioning, hey, we're not bringing any sacrifice. And Abraham says in a longer version of this, don't worry, the Lord will provide. But all the time in his mind, knowing that his son was going to be the sacrifice. And they go to a hillside, which happens to be in the area of Jerusalem. They didn't have the city of Jerusalem at the time, but it was in that general vicinity, a small hill somewhere around Jerusalem. And he puts wood on the altar. And then he prepares to sacrifice Isaac, no doubt to kill him with a blood libation and then to immolate him by burning him on the wood, offering up that body to God. A horrific moment. A horrific moment. And Abraham gets the knife ready, and suddenly he's stopped from carrying out the sacrifice by a voice from heaven. By a voice from heaven. And they see a ram caught in the bushes, and they offer up the ram. What a moment. But Abraham had to think, well, God knew everything. Why did he put me to this test? Because it wasn't about the faith of Abraham. It was about another story that would happen 1,700 years later on either that exact hill or another hill around Jerusalem. The hill that was called Golgotha, not because it looked like a skull, but because there was an ancient tradition that the skull of Abraham was buried under that hill. The one who made things wrong with God through rebellion. And another 30-something person would be brought to that hill and offered on a different type of wood, the wood of the cross. Now you remember Adam had a choice. He could have eaten from the tree of life and been immortal, or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he made a bad decision, so that corruption and evil flowed through human nature, weakening us forever. And there was an angel put to guard the garden so that people could not go now and eat from the tree of life. But now the tree of life appears on a hill near Jerusalem, made of dead wood, but the living God would be placed on it. And Mary would look up at that cross and see the fruit of her womb there, dying, but making things right for God, between humanity and God. In one sacrifice, which would eclipse all others, fulfill all others, making things right between God and humanity. And from that cross would flow, not like from the blood of Abel, who was slain by his brother, over a liturgical question, it's true. What's the best way to worship God? And that blood would call out for justice. The blood of Christ would call out for mercy and forgiveness for humanity. And in this Lent, we prepare ourselves for Good Friday so that we can let that blood of the Lamb flow over us, make us right with God, and give us a peace that the world cannot know. Now there's another element in the story of Abraham. After he is stopped from offering his son, God makes him a promise that say, through that one son, you'd have a great large family that would be a blessing for all of humanity. And so has his descendants been, because out of his descendants would come the great lawgivers and the prophets of Israel, that gave humanity a conscience to say, look out for the weak, the widow, the orphan, the poor, the stranger in your midst. That comes from the prophets of Israel. Long before any social reformers thought of this. This gave humanity a huge conscience, and with it a huge responsibility. But what a blessing having that conscience has been for all of humanity. Your descendants will be a blessing for all of humanity. And of course, amongst those descendants would be the family we call holy, Mary, Joseph, and the ultimate Jew, Jesus, who allowed himself to make things right between God and man. Now, there's something demonic in the world. And this is something very chilling and frightening. Here is in the book of Genesis a promise from God. He doesn't take back his promises, that the Jews would be a blessing for the world. But over and over we hear throughout the centuries, and we hear today, the Jews are a curse on the world. So that all evils are one way or another attributed to them. If there's a financial downturn, it's the Jews' fault. If there's a war, it's the Jews' fault. This notion that everything could be pinned on the Jews. It's funny, during times of peace and prosperity, no one said, boy, the Jews are doing a really good job these days. That's the demonic twist to divine revelation. Blame it on the Jews. And if the demons of hell could get Catholics to blame it on the Jews, it's a double victory. First, you undermine the prophets and power of Israel. You attack God and his promises because you say God's taken back his promises. God can't be trusted. Sure, he can make you a promise, but Lord only knows whether he'll keep them. And suddenly here we as Catholics who believe ourselves as the direct spiritual descendants of Christ in the believing church, well, if I could get the Catholics to hate the Jews, then they'll ultimately hate Christ, who was a Jew. What a demonically powerful way to corrupt the human soul, mind, and imagination. And most recently, I've seen in some anti-Semitic thoughts, well, the reason why there's such widespread abortions, well, of course, it's the Jews' fault. And so we have to be careful against all of that, the demonic twisting of divine truths. Now, we hear that promise that the world would be blessed through the Jews, given to Abraham. And now we see on the Mount of Transfiguration, again a mountain near Jerusalem, a different story, where suddenly the great people of Hebrew history appear, Moses and Elijah. Moses, the lawgiver, the giver of the Ten Commandments. We realize if we didn't have the Ten Commandments, what would our conscience be? And what would the conscience of humanity be? And Elijah, the one who turned a nation from corruption and death back to the worship of the living God, conversing with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. Elijah, whose feet never touched the ground up until that moment when he was conversing with Jesus. Moses, who never was able to enter the Holy Land, but died just short of it, now at the invitation of Jesus, enters the Holy Land. We see the emergence of all divine revelation for the inspiration not only of those three apostles, but of the world. And we hear a voice from heaven, just as Abraham heard a voice from the angel, and says, "This is my beloved Son." And that Son is the one we trust, and why we learn how to live and love in this world and commit endless acts of random kindness that far outweigh any of the evils that have been done in the name of religion.